21st of July 25. You can join me as I try to find the missing £22 billion that the Labour were talking about, or Rachel Reeves in particular. Well, it wasn't so much it was missing, I think it was maybe an overspend or a gap, as they called it. Yeah, when I heard about this, I don't really follow mainstream legacy media anymore, so, and even I've stopped even looking at Daily Mail, which I thought I would never do, Daily Mail online. I don't really look at that anymore. I just follow people on X and things to find out what's going on YouTube and stuff. So, but what I've always found about these sort of things is it's just either it's confusing or I'm just not clever enough to understand. But I think it's just either confusing or maybe even nobody really knows, what's going on. So I was trying to find out, is this true, because my instinct is, well, it's probably not true, or at least in the way she's saying. So I don't think the Tories have done a good enough explanation to say it's not true. Well, to me anyway, to Joe Public or whatever you want to call us, the ignorant public. So I was just looking at this. I asked Google Gemini Flash 2.5 and it says, yes, in July 24, after the general election, the incoming Labour government, with Rachel Reeves as Chancellor of Exchequer, claimed that the previous Tory government had left a £22 billion hole or overspend in the public finances for 2024-25 financial year. So that's actually, that means it was predicting it, because it was 25 was still to happen really. And when did they do this from? Is this from October to October or April to April? The figure was based on a Treasury public spending audit that was referenced by Rachel Reeves. She stated that this projected overspend was due to factors such as overspends on, that system. Well, that's not a surprise really, is it? I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. And the transport budget, as well as the general impact of inflation on departmental budgets. The Tory party and their former Chancellor Jeremy Hunt disputed this claim, suggesting it was an attempt by Labour to set the stage for potential tax rises that they had not announced before the election. But I mean, he's conflating two things. Is it right? That's all I want to know, really, I'm not bothered with what the reasons are. I'm just want to know it's right. It's turned out not really true anyway, from what we've seen, Independent fact-finding organisations like Full Fact have examined these claims. While the 22 billion figure itself came from a Treasury audit, the extent to which it was entirely unexpected or solely attributable to the previous government's actions was a point of contention and debate between the parties. The Office for Budget Responsibility had also noted additional spending pressures that were known to the Treasury, though their review didn't specifically confirm the full 22 billion figure as new information. So I'm still confused. I asked it, was it true? Yes, the claim of 22 billion gap or overspend that Labour said the Tories left them in 2024 was largely substantiated by an internal Treasury public spending audit. So the moment it feels like they're saying it's true, or this Treasury public spending audit is, here's a breakdown of why it was considered true to a significant extent, along with the nuances and points of contention. The source 22 billion figure specifically £21.9 billion, originated from an audit conducted by the Treasury itself, commissioned by the incoming Chancellor Rachel Reeves in July 24. This audit specifically found a forecast overspend on departmental spending for the 2024-25 financial year exceeding the limits set in the Spring Budget 24 by the previous Conservative government. Was it what it represented? This wasn't about the overall national deficit, but rather a projected in-year shortfall in day-to-day departmental spending. The overspend was attributed to various factors including unfunded policy announcements by the previous government, e.g. that, plus the Advanced British Standard Education Reform, aspects of the new hospital programme, increased pressures on public services due to factors like inflation and rising costs in areas such as that system and public sector pay, independent confirmation with caveats. The Institute for Fiscal Studies, a respected independent think tank, commented that the in-year funding pressures and overspends set out by Rachel Reeves do genuinely appear to be larger than previously thought. So this is someone who's maybe respected saying that. I think, well, I don't know. Well, they also noted that some of these pressures could have been anticipated. The extent of them seemed greater than outsiders could have discerned. The Office for Budget Responsibility, that's a government thing, I think. I sort of quango. The UK's independent fiscal watchdog conducted a review of its March 24 forecast. This review found an estimated 9.5 billion of additional spending pressures that were known to the Treasury at that point, but not known to the OBR when it prepared its forecast. While the OBR's review didn't explicitly confirm the full 22 billion figure, it also didn't disprove it, as Labour's figure included pressures identified after the OBR's forecast. Political framing. Well, it doesn't matter I just want to know if it's true or not, really. So, in summary, the 22 billion figure itself was derived from an internal Treasury audit. Independent analysis largely supported the idea that significant in-year spending pressures existed that exceeded the previous planned departmental budgets for 24-25. What did Jeremy Hunt say? Because he was the former Chancellor of Exchequer. Basically, he was the one that made that speech at the time. He refuted the claim. His main points were it was fictitious and shameless. Hunt called the 22 billion claim fictitious and accused Labour of a shameless attempt to lay the groundwork for tax rises. He argued that it was a political manoeuvre rather than a genuine reflection of the fiscal situation. Because of the line about 22 billion, to me that's pretty serious, but nobody seems bothered, He says the books were wide open. He stated that the government's books had been wide open and Labour should have been aware of the fiscal position. He implied there was no cover-up, as Labour alleged. Potential surplus, not deficit. In some instances, particularly at the Tory party conference in September 24, and this was after this internal audit by Labour and after Labour had come to power, Hunt went further, claiming that the Labour government could actually have a budget surplus of 24 billion, citing an article in The Economist rather than the fictitious 22 billion black hole. He also mentioned that a Freedom of Information request to the Treasury regarding the workings behind the 22 billion figure had received a reply stating they couldn't give the workings because they weren't sure they were accurate. So, I mean, that's good information to me, but why does everyone naturally still think it's true? My impression is that the public think there's a 22 billion gap. He's saying he put in a Freedom of Information request, or somebody did, and they couldn't reply, couldn't give the workings because they weren't sure they were accurate. And he also said, Jeremy Hunt said that they'd left a healthy growing economy. He maintained that the Labour government had inherited a healthy growing economy from the Tories. Focus on the future. Hunt also suggested that the country would benefit more from the government focusing on how to fix issues. Well, no, I just want to know about this first of all. Jeremy Hunt's position was that Labour was exaggerating or fabricating the fiscal challenge to justify future policy decisions, particularly potential tax increases. Well, I don't think they've done that though, have they? So I don't know. What did other critics of the report say? Andy Haldane, well, he's focusing on the political framing and gloom, so I'm not really interested in what he's got to say, because I've read this already. His concern was that the emphasis on the black hole could lead to a return to austerity, which it really has, I suppose. And by the way, patriotic millionaires say their idea of a 2% wealth tax on assets of people who have wealth over 10 million. Have you done that per year, you would bring in 24 billion a year, they estimate. So keep that in mind as well. That's just for those with over 10 million. Tory party figures, many other Tory MPs and commentators echoed Hunt's sentiment, saying it was a political device. Well, I'm not bothered about that. I just want to know, do they think it's true? They accuse Labour of manufacturing a crisis to justify unpopular decisions. You would think if somebody was lying about 22 billion, somebody would take them to court or something. You know, it would be slander, really. I mean, I wonder if Rupert Lowe would do that, you know, if he was a Tory or the Chancellor, ex-Chancellor. The nature of the whole questions about newness and unexpectedness. While the Treasury audit identified the 22 billion overspend, some critics and even independent bodies like the Institute for Fiscal Studies noted that while some pressures were indeed greater than could be discerned from the outside, others could have been foreseeable. This didn't mean the figure was false, but it questioned the degree to which it was a complete surprise or a deliberate cover-up by the previous government, as Labour often implied. Distinction from the overall deficit. Fact-checking organisations like Full Fact highlighted that the 22 billion figure was specifically a projected in-year overspend on departmental day-to-day spending for 24-25 based on the previous government's plans. It was not the same as the overall government deficit, and direct comparisons to historical deficit figures, e.g. the 2010 deficit, were misleading. Critics argued that Labour's rhetoric sometimes blurred this distinction for political effect. So this is to do with day-to-day spending rather than just debt, really. Because remember, we've been through COVID and the Ukraine war as well, you know. So to me personally, I don't know how we get out. I thought we would be in depression for a couple of years or something. Because we literally paid everybody not to work, you know. Impact on the civil service. Jeremy Hunt in particular raised concerns that Labour's claims risk bringing the civil service into disrepute. He argued that if the figures were truly a hole or overspend that the previous government had covered up, then the senior civil servants who signed off on the official departmental main estimates presented to Parliament just before the election could have been negligent or complicit. This put the Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case, in a difficult position, who later explained that the discrepancy could be attributed to the rushed parliamentary timetable and the different reporting periods for the figures. So I'm still not really any the wiser, really. In essence, while the existence of significant spending pressures was generally acknowledged, much of the criticism revolved around Labour's strategic use of the 22 billion figure to set a narrative of Tory fiscal irresponsibility and to manage expectations for potentially tough economic measures under the new government. Then I asked it how the 22 billion figure was reached. I just wanted to know exactly where it came from. It was derived from an internal Treasury public spending audit commissioned by the incoming Labour Chancellor Rachel Reeves in July 24. It represented a forecast overspend on departmental day-to-day spending, that's important, but for 24-25 financial year, exceeding the limits set by the previous Tory government in their spring budget 24. Here's how the figure was reportedly reached, broken down into its key components and the overall calculation. Gross additional pressures. The Treasury audit identified total additional spending pressures amounting to 35.3 billion. These pressures were primarily due to public sector pay awards, 9.4 billion. This was the single largest component. And who gave this? You know, is this Labour that gave this after they came into power? Because I remember they gave a big thing there. So that's what I want you to know at the moment. The previous Tory government had budgeted for a lower level of public sector pay increases. Labour's decision to accept the recommendations of independent pay review bodies for various public sector employees, often around 5% or more, for example, junior doctors receiving a 22.3% over 2 years, significantly increased this cost beyond what was factored into the spring budget. Well, I mean, for that, it looks as if Labour are to blame for that, so that's the biggest component, 9.4 billion. I don't know. Normal reserve claims, 8.6 billion. This is somewhat less detailed category, but it refers to the depletion of the Treasury's Central Reserve. This reserve is meant to cover genuinely unexpected events. However, the audit found that it had been used to cover a range of pressures, some of which were arguably foreseeable, leaving us a significant shortfall. And then on this issue, 6.4 billion, well, I don't think anybody will be happy with that really, or well, quite a few people, reform voters. So this is something that, because the government can't control who's coming in and stuff, so from that point of view, and I think Labour are going to be worse on this issue, so the costs associated with supporting, including accommodation, e.g. hotels and processing, had risen significantly and were not fully funded within departmental budgets. So that's like 15 billion of it, maybe 16 billion, on two things that you could maybe blame Labour for, or because the Tories might have had their thing in if they'd stayed longer, but Labour scrapped that as soon as he came in. It was the first thing he done. Yeah, so I don't think there's much sympathy for Labour over those two things. So that's leaving 7 billion now. Additional rail passenger services and maintenance costs, 2.9 billion. Pressures within the rail network included increased operational costs and maintenance requirements contributed to the overspend. Didn't Labour give a big pay to train drivers as well? I don't know, but maybe that's nothing to do with this. New policy commitments. This included various policies announced by the previous government, such as extension of the Household Support Fund, launching the Advanced British Standard Qualification Framework, and additional bus services support. So I'll take that. Well, that was Tories, it's saying, brought the policies in, so that's 2.6 billion. What happened? Are they scrapped or what? What happened? Overhang from previous year's pay awards, 2.2 billion. Costs stemming from pay awards made in prior years that continue to impact the 24-25 budget. Well, that sounds like that would be the Tories to blame, I don't know. But additional military and civilian support for Ukraine, 1.7 billion. Ongoing costs associated with aid to Ukraine. Well, you can't budget for that in a way, I think, really. So a lot of it, I think, might be more to do with Labour rather than the Tories. Pay rises after the Labour came into power, and on that other issue, I can't help but think, that would be two of the things that Labour would be. Anyway, offsetting factors. From the gross additional pressures of 35.3 billion, approximately 13.4 billion were reportedly offset by a combination of reserve funds. While the reserve itself was under pressure, some remaining funds were used to offset a portion of the overspend. Other allowance slippage. In any large government budget, there's often some slippage where budgeted funds aren't fully spent or internal department reallocations can occur. These factors would have reduced the net figure. The net whole, the 22 billion figure, was the net result after these offsets. 35.3 billion gross additional pressures, 30.4 billion offsets, 21.9 billion. So really, I think the additional pressures were 35.3 billion, but they found 13.4 billion from offsets, which left 21.9 of this sort of debt thing. But like I say, I possibly think Labour maybe to do 15 billion of it, I don't know. Key contextual points. In your overspend on RDEL, it's crucial to remember that this figure specifically relates to projected overspend on day-to-day departmental budgets for the current financial year 24-25, not the overall national debt or deficit over a longer period. Baseline, the overspend was calculated against the spending totals that were set out in this Tory government spring budget 24. Political interpretation. Well, the figure itself came from a Treasury audit. Labour's characterisation of it as a whole or unfunded was a political interpretation aimed at highlighting what they saw as fiscal mismanagement by the previous government and setting the stage for their own economic decisions. So then I just asked her, which non-government groups or people agree with the figure or don't disagree? So let's see. Groups that agree with the, even if not strictly the 22 billion as new information. The Institute for Fiscal Studies, highly independent, respected economic think tank, broadly acknowledged that there was significant financial pressures. While they noted that many of the challenges Labour outlined this week were entirely predictable, they also stated that some of the financial pressures facing the new government did genuinely appear to be greater than could be discerned from the outside. This suggests they found the substance of the overspend plausible, even if the surprise element was debatable. They had previously estimated a shortfall of 10 to 20 billion by 28-29, which gives context to the scale of the problem. Office for Budget Responsibility, well, that's a government quango, even if they're allowed to make their own decisions. As the UK's independent fiscal watchdog, they get the predictions wrong all the time, but it doesn't seem to matter. They usually overestimate or something, I can't remember, but the OBR conducted a review of its March 24 forecast. This review found an estimated £9.5 billion of additional spending pressures that were known to the Treasury at that point, but were not known to the OBR when it prepared its forecast. Well, the OBR chair, Richard Hughes, carefully stated that nothing in our view was a legitimisation of that £22 billion. He did not deny the existence of significant undisclosed pressures. The OBR's findings, while not confirming the full £22 billion, indicated that a substantial portion of unannounced pressures existed. The difference between the £9.5 billion and Labour's £22 billion was partly explained by Labour's figure, including pressures identified after the OBR's forecast was made. Full fact, this independent fact-finding charity examined the claims. They concluded that public finances are worse than Labour expected before entering government, with the Treasury identifying a £22 billion shortfall this year. They acknowledged the figure came from a Treasury audit, while also noted the political spin and debate around unexpectedness. They didn't dispute the arithmetic of the Treasury's audit itself. And groups that disagreed, Andy Haldane, as I say, he's not actually talking about whether it was true or not. Richard Murphy, I've got great respect for this guy. You should look at his YouTube channel. Professor of Accounting and prominent tax justice campaigner. Murphy, from a heterodox economic perspective, often associated with modern monetary theory, argued that it's technically impossible for the UK government to have a black hole in its budget because the government, as an issuer of currency, can always create the money it needs, while not denying a numerical accounting of a projected overspend against previous plans. He fundamentally disagreed with the idea that this constituted an unavoidable hole that had to be filled by painful tax rises or spending cuts. He suggested various alternative ways the government could address the spending without pain, such as through central bank operations or by dropping interest rates. His criticism was more about the economic philosophy underpinning the black hole narrative rather than the accounting. Yeah, I've great respect for him. He's definitely worth listening to. Some conservative-leaning media and commentators, while not non-government, many Tory commentators echoed Jeremy Hunt's view that the £22 billion was a political device or a myth designed to justify Labour's future policies, particularly tax rises they had not campaigned on. Their disagreement was less about the raw numbers. Well, that's what I want to know. In conclusion, while the precise figure of £22 billion emerged from a Treasury audit and was largely accepted as an accounting reality of projected overspend against previous plans, the debate amongst non-governmental groups often centred on unexpectedness or the political framing or the economic implications. And I just asked how often do such unaccounted overspends occur like that? And it said it's not an everyday occurrence. Well, I wouldn't have thought so. They're not entirely unprecedented in terms of underlying pressures. This is a department overspend rather than overall deficit. Yeah. So this is departmental overspend. So this is what this is all about. Why 22 billion was unusual? Well, it was significant for a few reasons that make it somewhat distinct. The size, a 22 billion projected in-year overspend, is a very substantial amount. It represents a significant unexpected pressure on the day-to-day running costs of public services. Combination of factors. It wasn't just one or two small areas. The overspend was attributed to a confluence of major pressures Large public sector pay awards, well, yeah, but who done that? That weren't fully budgeted for. Then this other issue, that shouldn't happen really. That's a failure of government. Ongoing real pressures, probably more Labour than Tory, but even Tory as well. And unfunded policy announcements. Timing, the revelation came immediately after a general election. Yeah. Lack of a recent spending review. The Treasury audit highlighted that there hadn't been a comprehensive spending review since 2021. Without these regular multi-year budgetary resets, departments faced increasing pressures from inflation and demand that weren't systematically reflected in their budgets, leading to a build-up of these unaccounted overspends. More common forms of budget overruns pressures. While a 22 billion in-year departmental overspend against budgeted limits is less frequent, various forms of budget pressures and overruns are common. Project overruns, yeah, like HS2, etc., are notoriously prone. Forecaster judgments. The Office for Budget Responsibility regularly updates its forecasts, yeah, because they get them wrong, for public spending and revenue. These updates frequently show shifts in the projected fiscal outlook due to changes in economic assumptions or new policy decisions. While not an overspend in the same way, they can reveal new fiscal pressures or headroom. Departmental transfers, supplementary estimates. By really reallocating funds or estimates during the year. So, yeah, this is a normal part of the annual budgeting cycle, but large persistent pressures can indicate systemic issues. Local government overspends. Local councils, particularly in areas like adult social care, frequently overspend their budgets due to rising demand and underfunding. For example, a recent report, July 25, found that councils overspent their adult social care budgets by $774 million in 24-25, the highest in a decade. Is that them all together, or is that each of them? I don't know. So, it's not an annual occurrence on that scale. These challenges come in the form of cost overruns, etc. The 22 billion figure was particularly stark due to its size, the breadth of factors contributing to it, and its political context. How much did the government have to spend in 24? So I just want to get some context. Everyone should know this, by the way. You know, it should be on a graph on Question Time every Thursday. I don't watch Question Time because it's silly, but so the expenditure for 24-25, April to March, was forecast by the Office of Budget Responsibility, who always get it wrong, to be approximately I think that's 1 trillion, is it? 1,278 billion. So I think that's 1,278 billion. But I could be wrong. This figure, often referred to as total managed expenditure, covers all area of public spending, including. So 22 billion is not a lot out of that, you know, but I mean, it's still a lot of money. Central government, departmental spending, day-to-day running costs, and investment. Central government departments were expected to spend around 450 billion on day-to-day costs. So 22 billion of that would be quite a bit. That's like 5% or something. Annually managed expenditure. This covers spending that is largely demand-driven and harder to predict, such as social security benefits, which were predicted to cost around 313 billion in 24-25. Net interest payments on the national debt. So this is the debt. That's around 105 billion at the moment, 24-25. It's important to remember that the 22 billion gap Labour referred to was specifically a projected overspend in department day-to-day spending. Within that larger total, meaning departments were on track to spend 22 billion more than their budgeted limits for the year, as set out in the Spring Budget 24. This was a specific issue within the overall framework of government expenditure. I'm going to ask you how much Labour are to blame for. Okay, this is a nuanced question, and it's essential to differentiate between Labour's responsibility for inheriting the existing fiscal pressures that made up the 22 billion figure, Labour's decisions after taking office that might have impacted the fiscal situation. Labour's blame for the existence of the 22 billion gap. Broadly, Labour is not directly to blame for the existence of the 22 billion projected overspend that they announced. This figure was identified through a Treasury audit of the previous Tory government spending plans and the pressures that had built up. The components of the 22 billion, as detailed earlier, largely stem from under-budgeted public sector pay awards. The previous government had generally budgeted for lower public sector pay rises than what was eventually recommended by independent peer review bodies. So did the Tories agree to that then? And what was deemed necessary to address recruitment and retention issues, especially given high inflation? Unfunded policy commitments. So, yeah, well, they're to blame for that then, I suppose, I think. I don't know. Rising costs in specific areas. Yeah, well, Tories and Labour are to blame for that, really. Probably more so the Labour, I would think. Lack of comprehensive spending review. Well, as I said, they hadn't done one since 2021, but how much did it cost, and how much use are they, really? Therefore, the genesis of the 22 billion hole lies primarily with the fiscal decisions inherited from the Tory government. Labour's responsibility concerning pay rises and others post-election. Where Labour does bear responsibility is in their decisions made immediately after taking office regarding some of these pressures. Accepting pay review body recommendations, a significant portion of the 22 billion was attributed to public sector pay awards. Upon taking office in July 24, the Labour government accepted in full the recommendations of the independent pay review bodies for 24-25, which mandated pay increases of between 4.75 and 6% for many public sector workers. Labour argued that these pay rises were necessary to address years of real terms pay cuts, improve recruitment and retention in vital public services, and prevent further industrial action. They highlighted that these were the recommendations of independent bodies, and to reject them would have been economically and socially disruptive. The cost, by accepting these recommendations, Labour effectively turned a projected pressure into a confirmed cost, making it part of the 22 billion overspend. However, this was a decision made in the context of budgets that were already insufficient to meet these demands under the previous government's plans. The funding for these rises were not adequately pre-provisioned. So I still don't know if that's sort of Labour's fault or not, Other decisions, e.g. Household Support Fund. Labour also continued or confirmed funding for certain policies, like the extension of the Household Support Fund, which contributed to the unfunded pressures. Again, these were decisions made with the context of inherited budgets. Conclusion: Labour is not to blame for the creation of the 22 billion fiscal gap that arose. However, Labour did make a conscious decision to confirm and incorporate a significant portion of these pre-existing pressures, most notably the public sector pay rises, into the budget, rather than seeking to immediately cut or reverse them. This was a political choice driven by their manifesto commitments and the immediate needs of public services, effectively acknowledging and committing to funding the pre-existing shortfall. So personally, I don't know. Did we know that the Tories were going to do those pay rises? That's a big thing, if that was 15 billion. Labour did do them all and did that other stuff. I mean, it looks as if they did almost all of the 22 billion, I don't know. But anyway, it's just something to think about and all that, okay? Bye, folks.